Fred Weir is a journalist and political commentator who joins us from Moscow. We also have Greg Simmons, who's an author and researcher, joining us from Uppsala. Welcome to you both. So let me first start with our guest there from Moscow, Fred Weir. When Russia says that the U.S. should come begging for having talks on this, I believe it's the fact that they don't have relations with the U.S., even though they may be interested, obviously, in this, and that is why they are saying that. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know. I'm one of those people who would say that nuclear arms control talks should be held on any given day, regardless of what else is going on. But it is a fact that there is virtually no communication between the two sides, and hasn't been for some time. It's just as bad as it could be in that respect. The Americans are acting in ways the Russians regard as extremely hostile in other areas. And one of the things, if to make sense of this from my own perspective, it is that the Russians have consistently throughout this war, it's now almost 4 months, they have stood up their nuclear deterrent, pointed to it and said, we have this. And their purpose in doing that is to deter NATO from getting directly involved in the Ukraine conflict. And so I can only see this as part of that. We're not talking about reductions or controls on nuclear weapons as long as this other stuff is going on. They're just underlining it to highlight this aspect of this overall crisis.
Well, if we were to take a look at the way that it seems like Russia is reacting to the whole issue, Greg Simmons, not to say that they're antagonizing the U.S., but basically they're saying when they're being treated the way that they have been by the U.S., along with its allies, but mainly the U.S., then even talking about it is useless. Of course, what Fred Weir says there is very important, and that is the fact that they just want to make sure on the possession that they are showing that to the U.S., so obviously for this not to be used.
Yeah, well, I mean, what Fred Weir says makes absolutely perfect sense. And I mean, I agree fully. One should also take into account the rather checkered history of US negotiations. I mean, Iran knows what the US word is worth, or what an agreement is worth with the JCPOA. I mean, the United States has also been withdrawing from numerous arms control treaties which it has signed, or not renewing them. So, I mean, it has this history of bad faith negotiations. And what's more, I mean, as has been noted by Fred, I mean, currently the US has positioned itself in a proxy war that it wants to see Russia weakened. I mean, there is going to be no negotiation with such geopolitical circumstances as what we see now.
Great. Let's take a listen to some of the online posts on this as reflected through social media, and we'll get right back to the conversation. Our first post, a dimension of American commitment to nuclear non-proliferation since the early 1960s is that the spread of nuclear weapons triggers regional arms races and crisis instability that makes it very difficult for the global hegemon to respond in places and times of his choosing. With each new arms shipment, it is increasingly impossible to deny that the war being waged in Ukraine is a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, pitting the world's two most powerful nuclear arsenals in a standoff that is spiraling out of control. The Russians don't need to use nuclear weapons. They were smart enough to invent conventional weapons like Sarmat that no defense system can stop today before they went into Ukraine. The nuclear danger comes from the US idiots, not Russia. In the final post, the American people will not come to your aid if you provoke a war with Russia. NATO is a defensive treaty. It's not a license for you to start World War III. Fred Weir, coming off one of these viewer comments in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, from what I understand from what you have said, are we looking at a scenario regarding the conflict in Ukraine that there may be thoughts of it being used from either side?
I don't think so. As far as I can see, since the beginning of this, Russia has, rather ostentatiously, it's true, featured and highlighted its nuclear deterrent, but with one purpose in mind, and that is to prevent the war widening by direct NATO intervention in Ukraine. And that's worked. The suggestion that the Russians would use these weapons in Ukraine, even when they were like on the back foot early in the war, was never made any sense. There's no military objective, and now that they're clearly winning in a slow but methodical way in the Donbass, there's no military objective that is posed to them that would require anything other than the force that they're applying. So, no, I think that as long as the war, that red line remains, nobody from outside directly intervenes. They've been intervening in all sorts of roundabout ways and questionable ways, I guess, but the direct insertion of NATO forces into Ukraine, I think that's what or creating a new no-fly zone or peacekeeping or any other thing that crosses that line hasn't happened and probably won't happen as long as that nuclear deterrent is on show.
I'm looking at another viewer comment here, Greg Simmons, that says the Russians don't need to use nuclear weapons. And then this particular viewer says they were smart enough to invent conventional weapons like Sarmat. I'm not too sure what that is, but it says the nuclear danger is coming from the U.S., not from Russia. When you take a look at the U.S., it is currently, and from years ago, in the middle, or maybe in the beginning, of a nuclear arms renovation to the tune of $2 trillion. So what is all this talk, anyways, about the reduction when this is happening? Maybe I'm not appropriating that renovation properly, but also the fact that they have pulled out of nuclear treaties. So what is the U.S. direction or incentive on this?
No, I mean, all of those things you point to, I mean, indicate that the US is in the process of rearming and, as you say, upgrading its nuclear capability. So, and given the fact that they've engaged in bad faith negotiations in the past, I mean, it would be rather foolhardy for someone to take their word at face value, because, I mean, all of these different things which we've just discussed now. I mean, the fact is that also, I mean, while we stress what Russia is doing with the nuclear grandstanding, I mean, there's been the threat of tactical nuclear weapon use from the US side with reference to this Ukraine conflict. So, I mean, both sides are doing it. It's, I mean, one can, like Fred, I would hope that mankind is not stupid enough to go down the same, road that will lead to a situation even worse than the 1962 Cuba Missile Crisis. But given the state of things at the moment, the lack of communication, this open hostility towards each other, and this escalating threat of force, I mean, one can never rule out inadvertent or misplaced, stupid use of force, which will escalate to that point.
Thank you very much for that. We do appreciate it. That is Greg Simmons, who spoke to us from Uppsala, author and researcher, and Fred Weir, thank you so much, journalist and political commentator from Moscow. And with that, we come to an end for this news review. Thanks for tuning in.